The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime. Hello, it's The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, as Art Basel Miami Beach opens, we discuss a new book, The Art Fair Story, a Rollercoaster Ride, plus Caribbean British art at Tate Britain and a virtual reality work in Miami. I talked to Melanie Gerlis about her book on the past, present and future of art fairs. As a huge new show, Life Between Islands, Caribbean British Art 1950s to Now, opens at Tate Britain, I talked to its curators, Alex Farkasan and David A. Bailey. And in this episode's Work of the Week, we're back in Miami. Aimee Dawson talks about Heaven's Gate, a new work in virtual reality, or VR, by Marco Brambilla at the Pérez Art Museum. Before that, the new series of our sister podcast, A Brush With, continues, featuring in-depth conversations with artists about the art, music, literature and film that's influenced them and the cultural experiences that have shaped their lives and work. The latest episode is with Pablo Bronstein. Do subscribe to A Brush With and this podcast wherever you're listening now. And if you like what we do, please give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It helps others to find us. Now, Art Basel Miami Beach is the latest art fair to return after an enforced sabbatical because of the pandemic. It coincides with the publication of The Art Fair Story, a new book by the Financial Times art market columnist and editor-at-large at the art newspaper, Melanie Gerlis. Melanie has been in Miami this week, and I spoke to her about the fair and the book. Melanie, before we come to talk about your book, you've just come back from Miami. How was it?
It was lively. It was buzzy. It wasn't crazy daisy. I mean, I'm sure you've been as well to the Miami Fair and the beach, and when you can barely walk in the aisles of the fair come 3:00 in the afternoon. And then
actually, no, I've never been to Miami.
Okay. Well, there comes a point and what they've done is that they've done extra timed entry to the fair, so across 2 days. And I think, look, the reality is not as many people are traveling. A few galleries were very, very conscious of not holding parties, and not all of them, but a few were, just to sort of reflect slightly different times. But it was still buzzy. The sun shone. There were some great museum openings. The Rebel collection looks amazing. And yeah, people were pleased to be there.
Right. And obviously there's this new variant of COVID-19 which has emerged. Was there much talk about Omicron there?
Oh, definitely. I mean, a lot of us were at the airport, trying to reorganize tests because not to get too technical, but we'd organize lateral flow tests, and then you had to change those to PCRs, and we were all on the hop. And there were a few jitters. There are obviously a few South African galleries who all made it in some shape or form or other, but possibly not the same people who were meant to come came. William Kentridge, the artist, was meant to come out to see a show at his gallery, Goodman Gallery, who had a pop-up, and he couldn't come. I think it was more that it was a reminder of the fragility of all this, that we keep saying we're in a post-pandemic time, and we're not.
Absolutely. And actually, that's a neat segue into your book, because obviously you wrote your book, The Art Fair Story, at that moment where, after this extraordinary growth in the art fair world, it suddenly hit a buffer. So can you say, what was it like to write a book in that context? Because here you are talking about this roller coaster ride, and it suddenly had the completely new twist.
Yeah, exactly. It was interesting. I mean, one thing I realized straight away was that the reason I had time to write a book was because I wasn't jumping on planes and going to art fairs. And it made me think a little bit about, our choices and what we're all doing, herring around the world. But the other thing I would say is when I started it, I thought it's done. This art fair industry is over. We tried, because I think what people maybe don't remember is even before the pandemic, there were moans and groans, and it's just economically for galleries, never mind there are lots of tired journalists, for galleries it's economically quite tricky for most galleries. It adds to the risk of it all. And during the 6 months of writing, it became apparent that they weren't completely going away, and in a positive way, that there are reasons why we still need some art fairs. So it was quite an interesting journey, actually. I probably went from these are done to They've suffered a few blows before, but this will change things.
Right, exactly. Really intriguingly, the book looks at the sort of gestation of the art fairs. And one of the things I think that would surprise many readers is, in a way, there was actually quite a noble intent. It wasn't all about money in the first instance. It was actually about making sure that people could see contemporary art, because, of course, it was pre the booming contemporary. Every museum now, all the national galleries, the old old master galleries want contemporary art now. But that wasn't the case back when Art Cologne begins, and you begin with Art Cologne in 1967.
I do, yes. I mean, I think the model of art fairs was around in some ways before Cologne, but in terms of the modern day art fair, and indeed, as you're saying, for contemporary art, Cologne was the first of its kind. And yes, absolutely, there was a real need to jumpstart a market pretty much from zero, especially in Europe, where because after the war, everyone had moved to America and no one wanted anything German and cutting edge. And just it is really, really hard to imagine that auction houses didn't sell contemporary art, and there was nowhere, you had to make your way to a gallery in a slightly difficult place and really, really love it to find it. So there was a real need.
Indeed. And one of the interesting things about the book is that you chart, in a way, the growth and the decline of certain fairs. And obviously Art Cologne, therefore, this was a real, sort of trailblazer. But it was actually Art Basel that followed slightly in its wake that's become this sort of unbelievable behemoth. This is, and still the fair that everyone always says is their favourite.
It is. It's interesting to see why some fairs survive and why some fairs wax and wane. And the reality is most wax and wane, and quite a lot that don't make it through. But yes, it's interesting to look at maybe why Art Basel. And I think one reason is that it started out a bit more internationally than Cologne. It started out being open to people from overseas, and the Americans were very important. And there are some really prosaic reasons as well. I mean, Basel was in June. And June is the end of the year when dealers have an inventory to get rid of, and everyone's making their way to Venice. It's the end of the art market season. There are some fascinating. Sometimes it's venues, that make the difference. So there's some serendipity, but also I think Basel was just very strict with its selection, and sometimes I think someone said to me, "You need to be a little bit elite."
Right, that's it. And is it Monica?
That's right, Monica Spruce, exactly. Thank you. I'm glad you remembered. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and that still comes across today, doesn't it? I mean, and everybody who goes to, I've never been to Art Basel, but everybody I know who goes there always says there's a sort of certain refinement, and it seems that in a sense that's part of the brand. It's only the top galleries get in here, sort of thing.
Exactly. It's quite stately, and it reflects, what I should have mentioned is a very, very long, deep tradition of private collecting in Switzerland, and around the Rhine area. But that's also partly why Miami is so interesting, because when Art Basel launched in Miami, it was launching in a very different type of place with a very different type of fair. But that was around the time, and in fact, it launched in 2002. It's another twist in the roller coaster. It was meant to open in 2001. But unfortunately, 9/11 happened that year and no one was traveling. People were traveling even less then. But by then, the market had just become much more internationalized and a bit more fun.
The story of art fairs in the US is really interesting, isn't it? Because Chicago had a really major fair, and again, a sort of the most prominent US fair for a while. But of course, now New York is the focus for fairs mainly. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the US is really, really interesting because absolutely, it's interesting already that Chicago was the first place, in the same way as Basel had all the rivers and railways. Chicago had lots of airlines and some great museums, and a love of contemporary art and contemporary music. It was the perfect place, really. It was just, unfortunately, a mess. For 20 years, it ran phenomenally. It was the fair in America, and at the right time. Because what has also happened since in the US is it's a lot more fragmented as a fair location than anywhere else in the world. Everywhere else has one definite leading fair. And yes, the Art Basel Miami is probably the biggest fair, but it's not in New York, as you say, and all the money. I mean, throughout the book, the theme is that the art fairs follow the money and the money follows the art fairs. And that moved from Chicago to New York. And the art as well moved to New York. I mean, the abstract expressionist scene was really happening there. But then what you get is a huge financial crash. So you've got a fair whose organisers are in a mess. There's a ton of infighting. And then you have a huge market crash. And that combination, I think, was the death knell, really. Although I should say the Chicago Fair has revived. It still exists and is doing very well under Tony Carman. But it died briefly. And then New York was able to take over. And what happened through the terrible, sort of depressing years of the 90s through the 90s crash was you get these more grassrootsy, more fun, more artist-based. No one really expected to make money, but they hung out in a hotel and sold art.
Yeah, and that was the Gramercy Hotel.
Exactly.
And that's quite a legendary fair. It's one of those art world events that you hear stories about. You meet people who went there and there were all sorts of chaotic happenings.
Exactly.
And it almost doesn't sound like an art fair when people describe it. It sounds like a kind of an installation which involved galleries in some ways. It was really radical, right?
It was. The Chicago fairs eventually were bought by merchandise marts who were a very corporatized, they were in a convention center, as was Basel. The Maastricht Tefa Fair also existed by then. These are much more conventional trade fairs. And this was a crazy hotel. And the lifts broke down. And people were kind of drinking and smoking up the staircases from what I hear. But I think we do one other theme that came through the book is we all rather romanticize that. That's what we want art and artists to be, and it can be like that when there isn't much money sloshing around. We're all quite happy to be creative and fun and almost artist in a garret in a hotel. But as soon as that market came back, the Gramercy, which eventually became which is now the Armory Show. The Armory Show is now a bit more corporatized and indeed owned by Merchandise Mart, who owned the Chicago Fair.
Right. And interestingly, Frieze, the London Fair, emerged partly out of a kind of interest that emerged from the Gramercy Hotel Fair, right? That was part of the inspiration behind it.
Absolutely. Yes. I think there was another fair in Cologne called Unfair, which itself was slightly the inspiration for the Gramercy Hotel Fair. And Matthew Slotover, who co-founded Frieze, says, yes, absolutely. They saw these fairs. And again, that was the only way to see contemporary art. Frieze was terribly lucky in a way that an alternative sort of venue had been experimented with and seemed to be a success, because Frieze's tent has been quite a signifier, really, of its brand. Although I think that is also challenging in the 21st century environmentally conscious age. But that's skipping ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about Frieze, because one of the things I think about Frieze that I found interesting is that obviously being in London and therefore seeing the ecosystem develop. Before that, there was the London Art Fair, which still exists, and it was in the Islington Business Design Centre, which was always had other bits in it. And when you go back to the London Art Fair, it's sort of rather quaint now, and you can't believe that was a sort of top London art fair, really. But Frieze was this sort of, it burst into the London scene in a way which I don't think even those who knew it was going to be impressive could have ever predicted, right?
No, I think I call Matthew and Amanda sort of accidental entrepreneurs. I don't think even they thought it was going to be. But that was the time of accidental entrepreneurs. It was outside the art world. What Frieze was incredibly lucky with, really, was it coincided with this enormous boom in wealth that came through London. And London, was not only the sort of European centre of financial trade, but it was between the US and Asia. And it was just in a prime position. Everything was good. People were making fortunes. Investment banking was the job of choice, and it was self-made money. And what these people wanted was young, fun art, and we did have the artists. Now, how much this, as you said, it's an ecosystem, and this all relates. But the artists who came up through the less prosperous years, through the 90s, who we now call the YBAs, coincided with money. It's a match made in heaven, really.
Frieze now is the catalyst for everything that happens in that season in London. And what I mean when I say that it has that surprising effect is it's extraordinary that, for instance, the National Gallery's programming is worked around Frieze. The Tate's programming fits around Frieze. The extent to which you can have a commercial fair which dictates the whole cultural moment, seems to me to be indicative of the kind of boom of fairs that you write about. That's I think you call it the glory years.
Yeah, I do call it the glory years. Exactly, that was when it all became, or the golden years. I think of art fairs. But yeah, I think that was when they're at their most powerful in a positive way, and I think being able to have that sort of cultural power within a city that already has phenomenal museums. And I think I'm not sure people at the National Gallery and Tate really like to admit that is what they do, but they know they're doing it. It's a sort of begrudging acknowledgement that what happens in October in London is a lot of money from all around the world comes to town.
Exactly. The period since the golden years is obviously really it's very difficult to nail down because it's so international, it's so broad ranging. But I'm interested in something you said quite early on in this discussion, which was about how even before COVID, there were question marks around art fairs. Can you say something about what you mean by that? Why have they become difficult for galleries? Because it seems in the golden years that they weren't at all.
Well, I think what happened is, listen, art fairs have to make money. And, we talked about the Chicago Fair before, and one of the problems was that they realized this is quite an expensive venture to hire a venue and, build a city for 3 days. And that becomes an expensive proposal to the galleries who, they're essentially hiring a pop-up for 3 days. And the numbers just stopped adding up. And, as every fair becomes more and more prestigious, and listen, dealers want walls that don't fall down. It really is. It's amazing reading about some of the Basel in the early years with pictures on the floor. The dealers don't want that, or they don't necessarily want people rolling down hills inside the tent. So people want the fair to professionalize, but with that comes more money. And then the question is, who wants it to professionalize? Well, it's the bigger galleries with the bigger art and the bigger money who are going to be okay. And if you're selling works from 500,000 up, these fairs, you make your costs back. The cost isn't just the booth. I think this is the other thing people forget. The cost is also being in another city, bringing your staff to another city, or even a city in your own town. What do you do with your gallery space that you're also paying rent on? You need hotels, you need food. They do parties, even small or big. It's dinners. It all adds up, and it just wasn't the cost of bringing a primary market artist. I spoke to Josh Lilly at the Miami Fair, and he was absolutely delighted to have sold his Rebecca Marson work from the Meridian section. So for larger work, huge ceramic piece that was made up of thousands and thousands of ceramic pieces of leaves. And it cost him $85,000 to ship it over. That's just the shipping. And the whole thing sold for 300 or 350,000, I think. And, I could see him doing the sums in his head, and he knows even that doesn't quite add up. But what he's saying is, this is the best thing. This is the most amazing thing for my artist. And she's gone into 2 fabulous Texas collections, and it's very exciting. But there's only so many times you can do that. There's only so many fairs you can do that. And I think people were finding it, you could go to a fair. I remember seeing one dealer in a Hong Kong fair, so you know which one it is. But she was in tears because she'd bought a solo booth of, again, quite a pricey work to ship, and no one liked it. And she's a highly respected primary market dealer, but it just hadn't paid off.
That's so interesting. You've just been in Miami, and it's famously ground zero for climate change in the US. And there was a lot of focus on climate change in Freeze in October, and there's this Gallery Climate Coalition. And I'm just wondering about the sustainability factor, because that is a massive factor. If art fairs are going to continue, they have to find a way to justify how they can exist going forward, can't they?
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue, because we all say that we care, and as you say, that the Gallery Climate Coalition is specifically for the art world. But I got on my plane at Heathrow and bumped into 8 people I know, within 5 rows, So I don't know how seriously the art world players are taking it when we don't have alternatives. But it's not really in the interest of the fairs to provide us a complete alternative, because their very model is, as I said before, we build a city for a few days, come and visit us. I think avoiding temporary structures is one obvious area. There are now more choices. Not everyone does have to go to an art fair. You can browse through an iPad. They will take you. Art Basel will take you around. On an iPad, and you can watch through Zoom. You can do it by phone. So I think people need to be more aware of the choices. It's just, what does the art fair do as a model if fewer galleries show and fewer people visit?
Right. Early on in the book, there's a quote from Pat Hearn, the late Pat Hearn, who was involved in Gramercy. And she says that fundamentally fairs are an effort to move the product in whatever way possible. That's fundamentally what art fairs are about, right?
Absolutely. And I do think we should romanticize them, too much more than a washing machine trade fair. I mean, hopefully the product is more interesting. I mean, in medieval times, people were going to markets. If you were selling cloth or meat or whatever, salt, you would take it to a market where you got the highest number of people for the highest amount of time, and you made it an event, and there were events around it, and it galvanized all sorts of other conversation and activity. And absolutely, it's the same thing. And that's why I don't think the model is disappearing completely. It has existed for thousands of years. We just have technology now, and it's going to be interesting what that does.
And we also have cloth, meat and salt in art fairs, probably.
Absolutely. Some of the descriptions of, I think there's a 19th century poem by Tennyson on a great exhibition. It's like, it just sounds like a press release that I get before an art fair.
Well, Melanie, thank you so much for telling us about Miami and your new book.
Thank you so much. It was lovely talking to you.
The Art Fair Story, A Rollercoaster Ride by Melanie Gerlis is published by Lund Humphreys and priced £19.99 in the UK. It's published in the US and Canada next year and priced $34.99 in the US and $46.99 in Canada. Coming up, we hear about Caribbean British art and a VR work in Miami. But first, here are a few of the top stories on our website this week. The Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam is planning the largest exhibition ever on Vermeer to be held in 2023. Until now, the most ambitious show was organised by the Maurits House in The Hague in 1996 with 23 paintings, but the Rijksmuseum says that it expects to get 24 pictures and possibly more. Vermeer's total autograph oeuvre is around 35 works. As Martin Bailey reports, the Rijksmuseum, the Dutch National Museum, which owns 4 Vermeers, has never held a monographic exhibition on the artist since its establishment in the 19th century. Although exhibitions are not normally announced so far in advance, shows on Vermeer take many years to organise. The Amsterdam dates will be the 10th of February to the 4th of June 2023. The Array Collective, a group of activist artists from Belfast, have won the Turner Prize 2021. It was announced in a ceremony in Coventry in the UK on Wednesday. They're the first artists from Northern Ireland to win the Turner Prize since its inception in 1984. As Tom Seymour writes, the collective receives £25,000 in prize money, while a further £10,000 will be awarded to the 4 other shortlisted artist collectives. Array have been working together since 2016, motivated by activism around human rights issues in Northern Ireland and beyond. They created a shibin or pub without permission in the Herbert Art Gallery in Coventry, where the prize exhibition is taking place. The jury awarded them the prize for the way they, quote, were able to translate their activism and values into the gallery environment, creating a welcoming, immersive and surprising exhibition. A new interior design for the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, planned by Catholic Church officials and presented during a video conference earlier this year, has outraged critics. As Vincent Noss reports, although the project has not been formally announced, Father Gilles Drouin provided an overview during an online conference in May. Among the proposals are a sound and light trail, luminous mobile benches, and the possible renaming of some of the cathedral's chapels after Asia, Africa, and other themes. Among the critics was the Paris-based architect Maurice Coulot, the author of several books on religious architecture in the 19th century, who said, quote, "It's Notre Dame de Paris turned into Disneyland." You can read these stories and much more at theartnewspaper.com or on our app for iOS and Android, which you can download from the App Store and Google Play. We'll be back after this. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. On the heels of a successful 2021 sale week in New York, Christie's post-war contemporary art December online sales are live for bidding from today, the 3rd of December. First open, post-war and contemporary art showcases the defining artists of today, like Kondo, Warhol, Calder and Scharf, while the second online sale, Image World Online, property from a private American collection, presents an array of important contemporary artists such as Sherman, Prince and Wall. Both sales offer an opportunity for those just beginning their collecting journeys and for seasoned collectors. Find out more at christies.com. Now, the exhibition Life Between Islands, Caribbean British Art 1950s to Now, opened this week at Tate Britain in London, featuring 40 artists. It begins with those from the generation that the Barbadian poet and academic Kamal Brathwaite described as arrivants who came to the UK in the 1950s, among them the group known as the Caribbean Artists Movement. It then continues through successive generations and movements, including the Black Arts Movement of the 1980s, right up to artists with Caribbean heritage who have emerged in the last decade. It's a vast show taking an extraordinary range of disciplines and materials, from Aubrey Williams's abstract paintings of the 1950s to documentary photography of the 60s, 70s and 80s, paintings by Sonia Boyce, Peter Doig and Chris Ofili, excerpts from feature films like Pressure by Horace Ove, video works by Boyce and Isaac Julian, a 1-minute student film, Exodus by Steve McQueen, in which he follows two men carrying palm plants onto a London bus, and an explosion of media in works made by artists over recent years. It also reflects the rich intellectual background to the art provided by thinkers including Brathwaite and the cultural theorist Stewart Hall, whose memoir Familiar Stranger, A Life Between Two Islands, helped provide the show's title. I spoke to the show's curators, Alex Farkasan, the director of Tate Britain, and David A. Bailey, the organiser of numerous seminal exhibitions on diaspora and black representation in art, and the artistic director of the International Curators Forum. But before we hear from them, here's an excerpt from an episode of our sister podcast, A Brush With, in which I spoke to the Barbadian-Scottish artist Alberta Whittle, a key contributor to the Tate Britain show. Here she reflects on identity in relation to her native Barbados and her home, Glasgow.
I identify so strongly as being Barbadian or being Caribbean, but also making this choice to live in Scotland. And in some ways, I've at times felt, I think, quite uncomfortable with situating myself so firmly in this duality of identities. But I also think, the older I get, there's always this distinction being made about being from one or the other, especially in the UK, where I'm asked regularly where I come from. And when I say, well, I've lived in Glasgow all my adult life, people are like, yeah, but where do you really come from? And that's a really frustrating question to be asked. And I think it's now become a point of, me recognizing my choice, but also the fact that I've made this choice. This is an active choice to live in Scotland. It's also an active choice to really reflect on the fact that Scotland is a creolized space, which I don't think is ever really spoken of. And therefore, my Caribbean identity should be very welcome here and be completely anticipated and expected because it is creolized. Scotland would not be the place it is today without the Caribbean.
You can hear the full podcast A Brush With Alberta Whittle wherever you're currently listening. So now, my conversation with Alex Farkasan and David A. Bailey. Alex, I know this show has been in production for some time now, so I wanted to explore the gestation of it for a bit. Can you tell us about that background?
Yeah, of course. We've been working on it for about 6 years, and I felt it was a really important thing to do immediately on arrival at Tate Britain, actually, in that, well, it's such an extraordinary story. If you piece together the art history of the Caribbean connection in British art, wave after wave, I think it's a fascinating way of looking at the history of British art. And what's more, of course, that visual art speaks so profoundly with so much vivacity to a broader cultural, social and political experience. So I think, David and I had that shared interest not only in how art history in this country could look different when looked at from a Caribbean perspective, but also to see how the visual arts, a bit as we're used to popular music being or Caribbean literature being, to see the visual arts as this lens for a broader cultural, political, intellectual, human experience. So that's really what we set out to do. And I think it has particular resonance at Tate Britain as the home of British art. And I would say that, of course I was aware of David's many years of work as a curator, doing extraordinary shows on different facets of the African diaspora in this country, in the Caribbean, in North America. We had something of a shared interest in that I'd done a major show on Haiti, so I was already fascinated in the ideas, the intellectual history, the political history, the religions, the vernacular culture of that region, and wanted to know how that played out in the British Caribbean, while also, of course, being aware of this amazing heritage of Caribbean British art we have here.
And David, in your catalogue essay, one of the things that you say towards the end is that, in a way, this show is a kind of demonstration that multiple generations of Caribbean artists or artists with a Caribbean heritage are essential to the story of British art. And that's something that very much is played out through the show, isn't it? Through several movements and through multiple generations, these are artists that are absolutely at the core of the story of British art.
Yes, entirely. I mean, the show is really an intergenerational show, and it's been curated with that in mind. And so intergeneration in terms of age, but also intergeneration in terms of movements as well, which overlap, and which makes the show messy because it's not very clean, but then we feel that the history of the Caribbean is very messy, is very fused, is very kind of fragmented, and also is very much appropriated. So we have all of those elements within the kind of curatorial narrative of the show. And what's really interesting about those overlapping generations and genres as well is that it's almost like it's very kind of musical in terms of like they're very kind of tonal motifs that repeat and kind of come back and forth throughout the project, which is part of the curatorial narrative.
I think that's really interesting and really important, and it's something that really comes through in the show. I think Alex, in your essay, you say it's almost like the kind of echoes of dub. It's like there are resonances that carry through the show. There's lovely correspondences between works right at the start of the show and then much later. And so, I mean, the classic example being that you have the early generation of artists who are profoundly connected with Kamal Braithwaite, who is a leading literary figure, and right at the end of the show you've got Alberta Whittle directly quoting Braithwaite. So it's a really powerful dialogue across time, apart from anything else.
Yeah, that's right, Ben. I mean, in a way, we wanted to use simple linear progression as a foil against which these repeating patterns and these correspondences across time could play out. So, you do voyage through time. I think this is a really strong factor in the Caribbean cultural experience, and certainly reflected in artistic and intellectual sensibilities. You get these amazing kind of cycles of thought. And as you say, today's artists like Alberta Whittle or the Otolith Group would be quoting Una Marson or Sylvia Wynter or Kamal Braithwaite in their very latest works, or Isaac Julian a few years earlier, basing his video installation Paradise Omeros on Derek Walcott's great long poem Omeros, which is itself an Antillean take on Homer's Odyssey. So you get these amazing cycles, and I think one thing that's also so important and really important politically in the show is, and there's a moment in the exhibition that really makes it explicit, we've called Ghosts of History, where artists really play with diachronic time. They superimpose the present on the past, or the past on the present, often a deep past, and in particular, but in other ways, showing correspondences between slavery and its afterlives and the present. So say Labena Hamid's piece on Toussaint Louverture from the 1980s, where she's collaged in headlines from newspapers, showing how there's this kind of extraordinary stereotyping on hostility towards the black uprisings and other necessary conflicts of that time, that she writes on this portrait to Toussaint Louverture. None of this would be news if you knew who Toussaint Louverture was. Of course, the great leader of the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. So that's an example where I think the artists are really, mindful of these unfinished histories, these historical reverberations through time, a bit as Linton Kwesi Johnson was through one of his great tracks, The Great Insurrection, where you feel he's evoking the slave insurrections of the past in talking about what he called his own rebel generation, the generation that had had enough by 1981.
David, Stewart Hall's an insistent presence in the show, isn't he? You took the title of the show from his memoir, and there's a portrait of him, for instance, by Vanley Burke, a photographic portrait. But then there's also his ideas are interpreted and reinterpreted throughout the show, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, there are several figures and their voices and legacies that are throughout the show, but without a doubt, Stewart is one of them. He wasn't a member of the Caribbean artist movement, but was invited to come and speak to them in that early period. So he evokes that, and the images that we have, or what the images that are in the show are from Vanley Burke, and it's a very, very rare image of Stewart's office, actually, in Birmingham. I think it's important that it's from Vanley Burke because the idea is that it's not London-centric, and the whole thing about Britain and the Caribbean is that it was across, Wales, Scotland, and throughout England, but also the West Midlands, particularly, was an important region for the mobilization in terms of art. I mean, as we know, Birmingham has one of the largest Afro-Caribbean populations, but also Birmingham was the base of, cultural studies, Paul Gilroy, all that kind of intellectual writing and thinking, and also was the basis around the kind of areas of the Black Arts movements of the 80s. So for me, that image signifies so much through how Stewart always signifies so much. In relation to the show, I think the one artist who truly, really invokes the spirit of Stewart has to be Isaac Julian. And even though Isaac's works are particularly kind of located around the idea of kind of Caribbean poets, and Stewart has a phrase which he calls beyond the frame. We need to see beyond the frame. We need to expand beyond the frame and look at the critical ideas around difference. And I feel that's throughout the show, but Isaac evokes that a lot. And his first project, when he was leaving the art school, Territories, very much evokes that, because Territories is about looking beyond the frame, looking beyond the territories and expanding the territories to kind of include all these other kind of ideas around post-slavery carnival, sexuality, and police in the state, which is very much part of the writings of Stewart of the time.
Indeed. You mentioned Isaac Julian, and I think the two works that he has in the show are very illustrative of the kind of scope of the show in terms of Territories being really quite hard-hitting, having elements of documentary, but also theory, for instance. And then Paradise Omeros, which is a very poetic film, it has Walcott's voice in it, for instance. So you get these quite broad extremes of language across the show, and that's very deliberate, isn't it, Alex?
If I had to find one piece to encompass much of the concerns of the show, I'd probably choose Paradise Omeros, but that would be at a stretch. You have this amazing kind of split screen view of the diaspora. So on the one hand, you're in St. Lucia on beaches, on rainforests. On another screen, you're in a brutalist estate in London. And the same young man exists in both spaces almost simultaneously. You've also got the relationship between two generations, the parents' generation and the young man's generation. You've got the kind of syncretization that goes on in turn in Britain, with his arrival and as he's negotiating a British culture in Britain. And of course, a homoerotic narrative or suggestion of one creates that kind of fusion on a very personal level. You've also got the metaphorical, the supernatural, alongside the real, and I think this is a really important motif for so much Caribbean art. The way that so much Caribbean vernacular culture and the avant-garde culture that valorizes it as a way of finding a way out of colonialism, and it's the mindsets it's given rise to. That vernacular culture is so much about a kind of collective surrealism, not a surrealism located in the depth of the individual subconscious, but a kind of will through culture to surrealize reality, often as a form, I think, of resistance to those difficult realities, be they under colonialism in the Caribbean or in a post-colonial context of racism and discrimination here. So that's why Carnival is both a celebration and an amazing source of resistance, sometimes defiance. And these things, I think, reality, surreality, if you like, a pleasure, joy, celebration on the one hand, resistance, struggle, defiance on the other, so often appear inseparable in works in this exhibition.
Some things we've done intentionally with the show in terms of how we pair things and how we make things and connections. I feel some things conceptually just comes out of the moment of how we've put this thing together. And lots of people have remarked about the film and the moving image elements to the project. And I was watching how Paradise Omas and how that Omas is mirrored with pressure, with Horace Over's pressure, if that makes sense, in the way that, both speak to the intergenerational, the two generations, both play on the idea of the patois are in both scenarios, and both also speak about the kind of the domestic in relation to the global, in relation to that. But what's really interesting about the two is that we're looking at really two generations who are shifting the envelope in filmmaking. Horace Over is pushing the elements of the documentary, where he's using kind of the motifs of Italian realism within that, within the mise en scène, within that work. And obviously, Isaac Julian is always in the mise en scène within his work and pushes the elements of, as Alex eloquently points out, how the avant-garde in the documentary pushes it towards the element of film installation as well. And so, Horace never made a film that was meant to be shown within an installation environment, if that makes sense. Whereas Isaac's project is about how one pushes the envelope within the moving image in the installation environment. So I really feel that in addition to all the intergenerational elements and issues, there's also the form itself, whether it's painting, whether it's film, whether it's sculpture. We're really looking at artists that are at the kind of the peak of their careers, who are really pushing the boundaries with the ideas of people like Stewart, but actually the form itself is really pushed as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that comes through very clearly. And also how even within distinct genre, so for instance, there is, as you say, a lot of documentary work in the show, but how those documentary elements in the hands of different artists take on different powers, and how there can be a much more collaged aesthetic that feels absolutely as a form of realism as a documentary photograph of protests in Birmingham, for instance. Alex, do you want to say something about that?
Well, I would say the first part of the show, if we can think of it in 4 parts, which is very much about the work of the post-war generation up to the 70s, you get a bit of a binary between abstract painting, sculpture, very symbolist work on the one hand, some artists mining surrealism, but for new purposes, political purposes, and then on the other hand, documentary photography, as you say, very lyrical photographs of communities in Notting Hill, in Brixton, either, if you like, everyday life or struggles. So you have that, and then, but by the time you get to the 80s, artists are folding the documentary into the imaginary, into the symbolic. You don't get that binary of the kind you get in that first generation, where the photographers, I think, are doing something quite distinct from an artist like Aubrey Williams, for example. So there, I think from then on, and in particular when, in a moment in the show that we call Caribbean Regained, where after the 80s, where the work ceases to be so much about the here and now in Britain, the exhibition kind of redirects its gaze across the Atlantic. You get, I don't think you can make the same distinctions between realism and these other forms that are more symbolic, more abstract. I mean, take someone like Peter Doig's paintings, for example. You feel they occur at a kind of twilight, or, state between being awake and dreaming. And I would say it's that kind of transformative moment that a lot of the works situate themselves in. Or you take Sonia Boyce's film Crop Over. It runs through different registers. You have a traditional carnival character, in a way appropriating Harewood House in Yorkshire. Vast stately home built from the proceeds of sugar and slavery in Barbados. And you had that character impossibly relocated from Barbados crop over to this estate, to this aristocratic estate in Barbados. But then, you move into a sociologist talking about carnival, really dissecting its typology. And then you move into carnival as a real-time performance itself. So there you have really different registers that have different relationships to realism and the imaginary, combined, folded into each other. And again, I think this is something that Caribbean aesthetics is particularly rich in. There's not seeing politics, not seeing the imaginary as separate zones. And maybe one could see that, thinking about Haiti again, the Haitian Revolution famously, began with a slave revolt that came out of a voodoo ceremony. So the idea of the gods, the African gods or the African-based gods being inseparable from political revolution was perhaps unthinkable to those people, and perhaps gave them additional power, certainly courage, in the face of absolutely fearsome technology from, the imperial powers. So this is a very strong component of Caribbean aesthetics, and I think you see it in much of the work in the show, this sort of refusal of a kind of binary between the real and the imaginary, or what we would normally call the surreal, but the surreal is something collectively shared, done together.
David, I wanted to ask you about, because we're talking just as Barbados has become the world's newest republic.
Hey.
And so it's extraordinarily timed, your show. But it's vital to talk about this show also in the context of independence movements and pan-Caribbean politics, etc. Can you say something about how important those kind of movements in the Caribbean, the independence movement, but also Pan-Africanism, were to the series of movements, I guess, that the show illustrates?
I think it's very important to think about it in two stages. Firstly, there is the pre-independence stage. Or if you look at the writings of Julian Williams, he talks about, and also John LaRose, who was the founder of the Caribbean artist movement. They really talk about the notion of the 40s and 50s as the missing chapter in relation to Caribbean history in relation to Britain. By missing chapter, they talk about the idea that this was the period of mass mobilization, mass unionization, and it's important to recognize that, because when people from the Caribbean start to come to Britain, they begin to mobilize and they begin to develop their own movements. Hence why we have the Caribbean artist movement, because as John LaRose eloquently points out, it was a logical thing for them to do, because they were already doing it in the Caribbean, and all of a sudden England or Britain gave them the opportunity to do it across different Caribbean islands, i.e. they couldn't do it in Trinidad, they couldn't have this kind of cross Barbados, Guyana, because of the geographical nature, but in London somehow, and the cosmopolitan nature of London, they all came together, and it enabled them to kind of develop a mass movement and a collective identity and to organize collectively. So it's important to recognize that how the 40s and 50s were important about it, and how in particularly areas like Guyana, there were, works or political works, government works in progress that allowed artists to become artists, in terms of education, and the arts was very important in that. So already you had those foundations in place already before they came to Britain. And also the idea that somehow there was a pre-independent spirit in the work, in the writings, and in some of the performances in theatre as well, this is very much the case of Trinidad, where Horace Ove talks about the idea that it wasn't so much film that he was interested in. It was the idea that somehow in places like Trinidad, the idea of performance and ritual was very much part in play to kind of use to kind of stage a kind of reaction to post kind of colonial moment and how kind of Trinidad was being colonized, particularly by the Americans. So in that sense, the idea of carnival becomes an important, not only signifier, but becomes a way in which some of the islands, particularly Trinidad, get to kind of come together to think about how they can critically attack the post-colonial moment, but also at the same time, as Alex eloquently points out, retain the ancestry and spiritual spirit and folklore of the past. So it's really difficult to talk about the idea of political independence movements without having to think through about how these movements developed pre-60s when they all started to emerge, and also to think about the world globally in relation to that, because we are talking post-45, the world changes after the Second World War. By this time, lots of people from the Caribbean are involved in fighting in the different areas in the Second World War. So they come back with this sense of saying, well, actually, because of the notion of Europe, we are now thinking about ourselves in relation to that. Africa becomes very important in that, and so does India, particularly in places like Guyana, where they begin to be part of that kind of non-alignment states. So it's when you think about Caribbean independence, you have to think about it in the context of the global independence movement in Africa, in India, and post the Second World War, to think about how it was part of that kind of historical narrative.
I wanted to talk about Steve McQueen, because there's one work by Steve McQueen. It's a really early work, a student work, in fact, called Exodus, which is about 1 minute long. And of course, Steve McQueen's been sort of a talisman of a lot of material around this subject recently because of the Small Axe series. And I presume that was a factor in deciding not to go big on Steve's work in this show, in the sense that you can still watch Small Axe on BBC iPlayer for about another couple of weeks, I think. So everybody has to go and see those if they can. But he is a presence there, and he seems, he's obviously a tremendously important artist in this discussion.
The show has been conceived since 2015. And so we knew, and also I know that, Tate plans way ahead, but we also were thinking about how the works can speak to each other. And so it wasn't a case of that, the overexposure of Steve. I mean, Alex will talk about this a bit more, and also the fact that, he had there's a Year 3 project, and there was the Tate Modern project as well, which also included the piece that we have. We really were trying to focus on how the works themselves could speak to certain narratives of the show. I think it's fair to say, Alex, and that in some ways, I think I was immensely happy that the Small Axe series came about before the show, actually, because it was good. I think it was good timing, actually, more than anything else. It allowed us to create another dialogue with what's going on in terms of the greater sphere, because we see the show as a kind of expansive space that talks to things that are going outside of the Tate Cube, as well as what's going on within them, Alex, I feel. Is that fair to say?
No, it is. And Ben, I think you got it absolutely right. We thought this was a small, in a way, modest way of pointing to Steve's vast and very recent project on, reckoning with the Caribbean British recent past through the Uprising series, through, of course, the Small Axe films. And those works were made for television, I think is the other thing to say. So they weren't made for the gallery. But absolutely, we hope that the presence of Exodus would summon up that knowledge of Steve's extraordinary engagement, almost sort of forensic and super dramatic as well, engagement with these histories. I think Steve himself talks about, I've heard him talk about in interviews, he was asked, why didn't you deal with your own immediate heritage earlier? I mean, after all, this is an artist, a filmmaker whose first feature film was about the hunger strikes in Northern Ireland, not about police brutality, say, in the 1970s, as faced by the Caribbean community here. And he said that he needed that amount of time to process it. Plus, I think he commented that the elders found it very difficult to talk about. And, it's something that required a great deal of research on a one-to-one level. But I think also, as well as Exodus speaking for the immensity of Steve's engagement with ideas and experiences that are so important to life between islands and the artists in it, I think also, it's like I think in literary criticism they call it a metonym, where, one aspect of something stands for the whole. And I think that the Pots, that short journey that the two men make in Trilby's in 1993 when it was filmed, through the streets, through the markets, until just at the kind of 1 minute moment He can no longer see them because they're inside a double-decker bus on the way home. Those palms, of course, stand for, the geography of the Caribbean, where those men are presumably from. And that short journey of a few hundred meters tracked by his camera also stands for the immense transatlantic journey that they would have undertaken in their lives, with everything psychologically, culturally that comes with that the exhibition otherwise traces through works that are perhaps operating on a larger scale. So I do think in some ways it's the show in miniature, and not a full stop, because I think the end of the exhibition cycles back round again, makes you think of the beginning again, and makes you think of this as a kind of continuing story too. But I do think it's the perfect, apparently modest, but almost universal in terms of the themes of the show, way to finish a show.
Well, David and Alex, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this extraordinary show.
Thank you.
Thank you, madam.
Life Between Islands, Caribbean British Art, 1950s to Now, is at Tate Britain in London until the 3rd of April 2022. The accompanying book is published by Tate and is excellent. David A. Bailey's book with Alison Thompson, titled Liberation Begins in the Imagination, an anthology of writings on Caribbean British art and culture, is also published by Tate and priced £30. Steve McQueen's 5-film series Small Axe is available for free in the UK on BBC iPlayer until the 13th of December and on Amazon Prime outside the UK. And Lubaina Hamid's solo exhibition at Tate Modern continues until the 3rd of July 2022. And finally, it's time for our Work of the Week. Among the countless shows around Art Basel Miami Beach is Heaven's Gate, a new work by the video artist Marco Brambilla at the Pérez Art Museum Miami, or PAM. It's described by the museum as a lavish, satirical and vertigo-inducing meditation on the Hollywood Dream Factory, a work of digital psychedelia employing the same state-of-the-art computer compositing technology as the films it references. Aimee Dawson, our deputy digital editor, spoke to Marco about the work.
So I was lucky enough to view Heaven's Gate on a virtual reality headset, and it was this incredible visual overload where I experienced time travel from dinosaurs roaming around my head all the way through to the riots at the US Capitol that we witnessed at the beginning of this year. So can you describe a little bit about this work?
Well, this is actually the 4th work I've made using a video collage technique. That the first work was called Civilization in 2006. And this work is a little bit different because it takes 2 forms. One form is a physical installation where you're looking at this historical tableau made up of movie samples as almost like a totemic storytelling. And then the second version is where we levitate through this panoramic, and it's a much more subjective, kind of immersive way of looking at the story. But both versions have their own kind of psychological impact. In one, you're looking at a narrative told as you would in kind of a diorama at the Museum of Natural History, and in the other, you're actually participating in this ascension through the different levels of, they're both different levels of purgatory and different levels of history simultaneously, I think.
And can you talk about the kinds of images that you've overlaid? Because there's appearances from celebrities and obviously it's very Hollywood-esque. So can you tell us about some of the works and tableaus that you've taken from these inspirations?
Well, in this work, I chose samples from imagery that reflected kind of post-Depression, post-World War II glamour and extravagance. So there was a tremendous amount of imagery taken from Hollywood musicals, larger-than-life characters, superheroes, the modern equivalent now being superheroes, of course. And I think it really embodied the spirit of today in a way, because I think this was obviously made during the lockdown, as you know, and we were bombarded with information about the Trump re-election campaign, the coronavirus, economic situations, etc. And I think this idea of post-depression, post-war euphoria channeled through film, because the language of this is all taken from film, seemed appropriate to reflect this kind of dance of death, if you will, this kind of almost apocalyptic situation in which we found ourselves last year. So it really expresses itself in a much more euphoric way than the previous collages. And I didn't stay away from using recognizable characters that represented excess and glamour and consumerism. I really kind of leaned into that in this work.
One of the things that I was thinking when I was experiencing the work is that this fantastical world that you create really reminds me so much of like Hieronymus Bosch's really detailed surrealist paintings from the 15th and 16th centuries. What were your inspirations for this piece? Does that like ring any bells with you, or were there other artists or works from art history that resonated?
Absolutely. I think Bruegel was the primary influence and Hieronymus Bosch was the second one. So those are the two main influences on this kind of work, because it's really a kind of Baroque work in a way. And I think the way it connects directly to those precedents is the fact that it's a non-linear storytelling. So the storytelling is really the stream of consciousness in a way, and you're watching 20 or 30 different scenarios unfold simultaneously, and it seems they may be not connected in any obvious way, but thematically, when you're looking at it as a scroll and your subjective point of view is rising through it, they do tend to make sense maybe on a subliminal level, very much in the same way as Bruegel's paintings, in a more literal way. Obviously, the day in the life of a village and what went on in that village as a 24-hour period, all on one tableau, was his contribution to that kind of storytelling in painting. And I think this has a similar way of telling that kind of story, only using motion loops and visuals with computers. So it's a very high-tech version of the same kind of storytelling.
It's a very high-tech version of an old master kind of vision. And one of the things about it as well is how much you want to go back and look into that detail. On first experience, it's kind of quite overwhelming, and then you hone in on those details. At the PAM in Miami, it's being shown both as a video installation, as you say, of these kind of totemic screens, but also can be experienced on VR. And during Art Week, people will be able to en masse experience it with extra headsets. I wondered what your preference was, because of course I think the video quality is much sharper on a screen, whereas the headsets don't allow that same kind of quality, but obviously the experience is all the more impressive. So I wondered if you had a preference.
Well, I was very lucky to work with a company called Vive Art, which makes the state-of-the-art headsets. So there's no longer a sacrifice in the image quality when you're in the immersive version of the work versus the physical installation that's at the museum at the same time. And this will be the first time when we can have 20 or 30 people all entering this virtual reality world simultaneously, because since I made the work, HTC Vive have come out with a very portable headset that looks like aviator glasses, and you just put it on and it works. And we can have 20 or 30 of those and have large groups of people. So it brings it back to this kind of more communal experience, which is similar to the way you're looking at a physical installation, although each person is obviously having his own kind of interactive experience inside the headset.
It sounds like there's going to be lots of very cool looking people walking around the PAM experiencing this VR work. As you said, this isn't your first foray into the world of XR or extended reality. So last year you created The Four Temperaments, where Cate Blanchett performs 4 distinct characters based on personality types. Can you describe a bit more about that work and also what it was that attracted you to work in XR as an artist?
Well, I think I've always been interested in working with new forms of technology in my work. So I started working with LiDAR in, the 2010. I was working with video game engines in 2004. And I think in some ways it's a comment on the technology as well. So there's a kind of dislocation that occurs when we engage too closely with technology, and technology obviously has a bright future, a kind of utopian side, but also a very dystopian side. And I think the Cate Blanchett work, The Four Temperaments, again, the idea of reducing personality types into these basic stereotypes and these hierarchies of emotion and personality is very much the way we as humans are identified by algorithms and the way we're categorized into personality types so that advertisers can target in messages to us in a more efficient way. So in one way, it does use a very high-tech presentation because you have Cate Blanchett floating in your environment, speaking to you. But on another hand, it also shows that she's also trapped into these 4 archetypal stereotypes, which is very much the way we're being considered by governments and authority through technology. Like, for instance, I'm sure you know in China now you have kind of social credits. So if you jaywalk, you get a -2 points if you do. So you basically accumulate a series of credentials that may or may not allow you to buy a house or get married or move to where you want to move to. So I think as technology becomes more intrusive and we depend on it much more, we're also trackable and categorizable, and we can be sold anything at any time with great ease. And I think we're moving into this kind of dystopian, darker version of what technology can do for people, I think. So that work reflects both those aspects of aspiration, because her character is saying, I love you in a very aspirational way, but yet the mode of seeing it and the mode of communication has this kind of weird dislocation to it, where she's trapped in her own stereotypes.
So fascinating. And will you be in Miami for Art Week?
Yes, I will.
And are you showing any works in the fair?
No, not in the fair, but I do have a talk, the viewing event that's on Friday, December 3rd at Pérez Museum. I will be having a talk with Franklin Sermons, who I've been in a dialogue with for about 1.5 years, setting up the show and all of that. So we'll have the largest VR group viewing event that's ever happened anywhere. And at the same time, there'll be a talk between Franklin and myself talking about the work and the physical installation as well.
Thank you so much for talking to us today.
You're very welcome. A pleasure. Thank you.
Heaven's Gate is at the Pérez Art Museum in Miami until the 1st of February next year, and an in-depth review of Heaven's Gate by the art newspaper's XR panel can be found on our website. The panel brings together a group of international experts in the field of XR, or extended reality, every month to critically review and make sense of the cutting-edge digital work that artists, museums, galleries and app makers are creating across the spectrum of XR, from augmented to virtual reality. Search XR panel on our website to find out more. And that's all for this episode. We're on Twitter at Tan Audio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. The Week in Art is produced by Julian Michalska, Aimee Dawson and David Clack, and David also does the editing and sound design. Thanks also to Henrietta Bentel and Danielle Hathaway, and to this week's guests, Melanie, Alex and David, and Aimee and Marco. And thank you for joining us. See you next week. Bye for now. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime.